We're so honored to have you here at the Herland Report, Bishop Harry Jackson. You are a famous person and a loved person in America. You've been featured in the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, the Washington Times, and we could continue. You've done a lot for this country. You're educated at Harvard Business School. And also you're a famous writer as well, with many interesting books. One of the books is High Impact African American Churches, which is something that really interests us because we do believe that there's a genuine spirituality out of those churches that maybe white America or America could learn from in a time like our own. And first and foremost, you are somebody that cares about humanity and cares about the injustice in society. Can you tell us a little bit about this engagement?
Well, that's very interesting. First of all, thank you for having me. Hannah, you pronounce your name a little differently than us cornbread and beans Americans, but I'm very thankful to be with you. You know, my sense of fighting for justice in this generation is born out of my very first year of life. My father was on his way home from a voter registration event, and he was stopped by a state trooper in the state of Florida, not far from Florida A&M University, and the state trooper made him kneel down. He took out his weapon, put it right next to his ear, and destroys the weapon, temporarily deafening my dad. Then he said, using the N-word, "If you do anything like that again, next time I'll kill you." So my dad got up from his knees. I imagine him starting to walk away, and then the walk went into a run and a jog. By the time he got home, he told this story many times later to us. He decided that he was going to leave the South as soon as he graduated. He'd been a World War II veteran, had been in the Navy. My uncle was one of the first African-American officers in the Army and was involved in helping to liberate some of the former SS prison camps. So it was quite that sense that there was injustice in our country was the beginning of my becoming something of an activist as my dad told those stories.
How interesting, and you have you've been a voice for social conservatism in this country.
Well, as the Lord began to talk to me from kind of a biblical perspective, that I was to become a prophetic voice to the culture, I soon realized that if you're going to write or you're going to interject your comments in the American social grid, you had to have kind of a bench, a team you were with. So I believe that my biblical views put me in the conservative side of the camp politically back in those days in the early 2000s in America. But on the other hand, we find that black conservatives and white conservatives, in terms of people who believe in the Bible, evangelical believers, they have two different worldviews, meaning that they look through, if I can do this illustration, different lenses at the world. The Bible talks about righteousness and justice, and blacks often look through a justice lens because we've been discriminated against in America. Hispanics the same way. Then very often, white evangelicals will look at things through what I call a righteousness lens. But the Bible does not teach righteousness or justice. It says that righteousness and justice are the foundation of God's throne. In other words, right standing with God, obeying the rules of God, if you would, and creating an atmosphere of justice for the least of these, the widows and the orphans, those who cannot cry out for themselves. Jesus is in fact glorified when the down and outs and the up and outs are both represented at the table of brotherhood.
That's so true. And when we come, as we come from Europe, we are on a tour here in America to explore what went so terribly wrong in America, because we see today a culture that is rampant with hatred, white against black, man against woman, the war at home, the breakdown of the family. And it's such a strange thing to us, because only 20 years ago, the U.S. used to be such beacon of, you guys were the melting pot, and anybody could come here and succeed here regardless of race. And there was seemed to be a thought of national unity and national identity. Yet today we see it disintegrate into new, ethnic orientation. Why is that?
Well, I'm going to say something that's going to really be challenging to people who don't know the Bible. And that is that Jesus, and you can't beat the prophecies of Jesus. I'll take Jesus over Nostradamus. I'll take Jesus over any astrologer in the world. I'm going to follow Jesus. He said in the last days, nation will rise up against nation. And the underlying Greek word simply means ethnos. So I would purport to you that the division that you're seeing now has been there in America for 400 years. When the first black people were dragged to this continent in chains and subjugated to chattel slavery, not allowed to get educated, not allowed to convene for church services when they first came here, because the experience of people who came under the doctrine of discovery, which many of our Roman Catholic and also our Protestant churches would have aspired to, said if you come to a heathen land, and you find people that don't know the Lord, it's okay for you to enslave, torture, and subjugate them. So America was rediscovered when people were already living here, because folks who had a "we are the chosen race" mentality, which is back to that racism Jesus prophesied about. He said ethnic groups were going to rise up in this kind of, I'm going to call it carnal and perhaps even demonically inspired sense of superiority. So America has always had racism fueled by fear and pride operating beneath the surface. There was a time if a man my skin color looked at a beautiful woman with your kind of eyes and whatever, I only would have to raise my voice and say you're cute, and I'd be tortured and lynched on the spot. That is the America that existed in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and the America that the hippie movement wanted to try to act was not still operative, especially in the Bible Belt in the South. So I believe we're in a time in which God himself is first exposing and saying to America, this is where you really are. And before your listeners get too agitated at me, racism is not just a white man's problem. We've got some horrible black racists who are talking about taking up arms, and many people who are in this nation and been here for a long time feel like their only hope is retaliate, like the guy in Dallas went to a high place and started killing policemen. And that was a manifestation of race masked by somewhat religious convictions. But in my opinion, it was inspired by darkness and demonic energy.
Is it also a class issue? I have a good friend, and he's pointed that out, that these things can really be described as a class issue, because as a European, I would look to London and England.
Yeah.
And in England, you have the same kind of, some are up there, the high-end, high society, let's say the ultra-rich. And then you have the lower classes that are disadvantaged, horrible schools, a lot of drugs, a lot of children born out of wedlock, a lot of poor families and all. But in England, both of these groups are white. And when you go further to the east, you'll find in China the same thing happening. There's a high class, and then there's a low class, or peasants, or people who live out in the rural areas, and they'll be massively poor. But both of them have the same skin color, though in America it just so happened to be. Would you agree, or is this a wrong analysis?
No, I think it's a deeper analysis. What I talked about in terms of race is kind of prima facie, on the surface, is kind of level one. In America, where we have been working at the narrative of what does equality and freedom look like, I think it's more true that the class distinctives are a part of the issue. And it's probably more true in the Western world now. I see the traces of rank tribalism, I prefer to say, than racism. The Bible teaches that we're of one blood, ultimately we're one race. So tribalism, I see, and I look in Africa, I see people that to me look alike, oppressing one another. But here I'd say generational poverty and classism, as your friend has shared with you, those two things trump the impact of race in the United States. In other words, if I'm raised in a family that's had 4 generations of people who have not gone on to higher education or kind of gotten out of the ghetto, they're more likely to wind up in those same circumstances, no matter what kind of opportunity would be given. And I also find that in the United States, if you go to schools, I was blessed to go to a little Ivy school and then to the great hallowed halls of Harvard. I've been in India, and they choose things to talk about, and they say, this man went to Harvard University, and all the way in Hyderabad, India, and beyond, in the Bay of Bengal, people have a sense that you're somehow accepted, honored, lifted up because of that class access that education gives you. So I think your friend has it right. But imagine America that has generational poverty, the lack of exposure and access that gives you, and you have a class distinction. You're locked into a world of lack of opportunity, and then on top of it, you're black. And that describes part of the problem. Or on top of it, you're Hispanic and you don't speak the language well. And or on top of it, you're Asian. And people forget that Asians in America, this really has been a nation that I believe has been evolving in her Christianity. We've had high ideals, we haven't always lived up to them, but we have imprisoned. When it says no, or I should say whites only, colored only, if you're Asian, if you're Chinese, if you're Filipino, guess where you could not go? You could not go into the whites only bathroom. You could not go in that time. People just forget that people of Asian descent had all the problems building the railroads in the West. And all those kinds of problems. The Trail of Tears, where we moved the Native Americans from some places in the South out to the Western reservations that many of the tribes wind up. They were carrying with them Native Americans, Black Americans, and anybody who wasn't white got moved with them, tortured, lynched, killed along the way. And so the doctrine of discovery was an aberrant religious ideology that worked here. The doctrine of apartheid is what fueled South African racism. I have the right to separate myself from you because God has made me superior because of the melanin or a lack of melanin in my skin.
It's quite a paradox, I do find, because among, okay, let's use that. I don't like that label, but let me use it. Among white Americans, there seems to be a doctrine now that they're trying to fight for Western civilization, And in the next sentence, they mention immigration. So they correspond, like there seems to be, correct me if I'm wrong, this sentiment that if we are to fight for the values of Western civilization, and then they refer to, of course, the Ten Commandments, work hard and then get your pay, capitalism, a man's right to own the labor of his own work, and, you know, trustworthiness, trustworthiness towards institutions, not much corruption. I guess that's what they're thinking about, and they're assessing that most of these values come from the Christian philosophy or the Christian morality, which is eroding in America now. So the point is really that if we are to get back this Western civilization and its wonderful values, we need to get rid of immigration. But I find that kind of strange, because when you look to the radical Jesus, he was a man of color.
Yes.
He came from the Middle East. It's not, you know, in my country, we saw these pictures of Jesus, wonderful. Everybody wants to identify with something close to them. So I understand. They put Jesus with blue eyes and white hair like mine, or very blonde and coming from Norway, and all of these very Aryan, places that also Hitler used to love very much. The Aryans, the white, the blue-eyed. But Jesus was a man of color in his sandals down there with his black hair and his brown skin down there in the Middle East.
He was all of that. But his actual skin color actually, I think, is irrelevant from this regard. I think what he stood for, to your point, transcends color. And I think one of the things that European Christians have suffered from, and it's made many people of color hate Christianity and call it a white man's religion, is that many people, they looked at the fact that Israel was the chosen people of God, and they were. And they were all Middle Eastern, Semitic-looking people. Many Europeans got the idea that they were like the lost tribe of Israel, and that somehow, whiteness was equated to godliness. Certainly Hitler believed that the Aryan race were God's chosen people currently. Many people don't realize in America, Margaret Sanger, who began Planned Parenthood here in the nation, was an ideological soulmate of Adolf Hitler and those who came before him. And so she wanted to basically abort black and brown children because it would create an impurity or defilement to the purity of the American races. So all of this is part of sin. But it's just as bad if black people, like I did some study of the black Muslims in America. They believe that whites were actually created by an evil genetic scientist who actually took the black folks and tampered with their DNA, and out came white folk. And so black Muslims, as part of their doctrines and the papers that they give out weekly in America, believe that all whites are evil. And so that's part of the fallen nature and part of tribalism. So, but yes, there's been a confusion among white evangelicals that somehow that foreigners are going to contaminate us, although I do agree with them on this, and that is the following. You should choose who comes into your country. And if you want to come to my country, but as soon as you get here, you're going to try to subjugate every person in this land of religious freedom to following Islam, I say stay out. What we have here and what we believe is that freedom of religion is actually a Christian value that people have a right to choose. And if you can't get down with the basics of what we believe as Americans, whatever we decide that is, then you shouldn't come here, and we shouldn't bring you here. And unfortunately, though, we have a xenophobic bleed through, hate of the foreigner, fear of the foreigner, that will bleed through. Now, newsflash. I believe that America will continue to devolve into division and tribalism unless the Christian church, who has at their root capacity, this is what I really believe from my scripture, we're the only group, Christians, black, white, Asian Christians, we're the only people that have the ability to rise above the sin of racism. But unfortunately, many of our Christian churches have reinforced the racism that currently exists.
And it's strange to me because, after all, it's written in the Holy Scripture, prophet after prophet, philosopher after philosopher, stating that God looks to the heart, but man looks to appearance.
Yes.
So, one can but think that if we are to be humble, if we are to be, low, looking at ourselves from a low point of view, and if we are to, try to respect our differences, that's such a heavy conservative thought, that we are to embrace the diversity that God created. It's not we who made the world with 10,000 trees and plants and they're all different. It's not we who made man look so different. I mean, that's the riches in our land, that we should join in on that thought.
Well, we really should. And I think that's where our evangelical, empowered brethren in the American church have failed us. They failed to create a sense of responsibility to look at the world through what God's eyes really are. We've failed to challenge people to deal with the heart revolution that must happen at the heart of Christianity, where John says this, the great apostle in the epistles, that we know that we've passed from death unto life because we love the brethren. And in John's day, that meant you had people of Middle Eastern descent, you've got people of Roman descent, you got people from African descent. So if you do not have love for the brethren and cultivate that love for people that don't look like you, but they are born again, they're part of this spiritual organism, the body of Christ, if we can't even live out our Christianity at that level, we have a counterfeit Christianity. And so there are blacks who are in the pulpit. I heard someone at the King Center the other day preaching so hard against Donald Trump. And so to me, if you hate someone and you're saying, they're evil, I'm right, and you're demonic, my Bible says that Satan is the accuser of the brethren. So Satan wants black Christians mad at white Christians. He wants Native American Christians to not trust any other kind of Christians. He wants Hispanics to believe that now this is our day and we're fighting in line to beat out the black people. He thrives on that confusion. And we're going to have to be countercultural if we're going to see this nation saved. And Christian presence and living the truth is going to be important.
And I would like to add the international perspective. I live in the Middle East and I work with Muslims and Arabic Christians and Syrians and many. And I would like to defend my Muslim brothers here. Good. Because there's also a reason why some of the black Muslims hate the whites so much, because when you look to the Middle East and all the wars we have seen there, we have been on the receiving end of all this destruction that on the many part they perceive as coming from Christian America. It's the Christian America bombing us, destroying our countries, supporting our corrupt leaders and paying up, in the pockets of people here and there. And in Arabic countries, the corruption is a big problem, and the people see how the Christian West is supporting that corruption. So also on an international level, there might be things we need to speak to each other to better understand each other. and to stop the injustice. And on that note, I would like to thank you very much, Bishop Harry Jackson, a great leader here in America and a leader for us to listen to also in Europe, for coming here to the Herland Report.
Thank you.